Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the What is the VCI-MUD project webinar. This is the first webinar of this wonderful project, and we'll be hearing more details to come. But first, we want to welcome you to the Mindful Mobility Tech Talk presented to you by the Green Transportation Summit and Expo, West Coast Collaborative Partners Meeting, and Mobilize California Driving Change. This webinar specifically is sponsored by the Columbia-Willamette Clean Cities Coalition, Western Washington Clean Cities Coalition, and the Center for Sustainable Energy. Before we get started, let's run over some housekeeping rules. First, chat with other attendees in the chat box. Say hi, make a friend. Next, you can ask your questions using the questions box on your Zoom panel. Feel free to log your questions during the presentation. We will touch on these and answer these first during the question and answer period. And finally, the webinar recording and slide deck will be available to all attendees. If you have any questions, please reach out to Maddie at cwcleancities.org. All right, without further ado, let's hand it over to Kevin.
Thank you, Maddie. I was having trouble reaching for my mute button, but I'm so pleased that everyone's joining us this morning to hear about this exciting project that we've been working on for a while and are excited to let a broader audience know about now. Hopefully you can all see my screen. So my name is Kevin Wood from the Center for Sustainable Energy. Providing an overview and some of the preliminary findings from our project, which is being done in partnership with Fourth, Energetics, and a lot of other great organizations. So the agenda for today is to give you an introduction to the project, to share some of the preliminary findings, to discuss the innovations that we're demonstrating, the toolkit that we're developing, and sharing more information on how you can get involved. So I'll be the primary speaker for today. I'm the principal investigator on this project that's funded by under a U.S. Department of Energy agreement. I'm also the coordinator of the San Diego Regional Clean Cities Coalition, and I have more than a decade of experience working with local governments and property owners to deploy EV charging infrastructure as well as on other types of clean transportation projects. So before I get more into what this project is all about, we'd love to know what kind of organizations you represent, just so we get a sense of who's on the webinar today. So you should see a poll window pop up and you can click if you represent a multi-unit dwelling property owner, manager, or resident, if you're a Clean Cities Coalition, local or state government, utility or EV technology provider. We didn't put in other, so hopefully you fit into one of those categories, but you can go ahead and click one of those boxes and hit submit. And we'll have a few other polls like this throughout the presentation to give you a chance to engage. So Maddie, whenever you've got some answers in, you can show. It looks like we've got a pretty good split. We do have some property owners, a good portion from Clean Cities, a lot of government, a few utilities, and some EV technology providers. So hopefully you'll all find something to learn from this presentation, and certainly this broader project hopes to have engagement with all those audiences. So thank you. So, why are we talking about multi-unit dwellings and why are we talking about, electric vehicle infrastructure more broadly? So of course, the plug-in electric vehicle market is growing rapidly. We've seen more than 1.7 million electric vehicles sold nationwide since the introduction of kind of the first modern mass market electric vehicles around 2010. There's more than 60 models now available and that number is expected to grow in future years. Electric vehicles are becoming more affordable. There's more capable models, including SUVs, and this year pickup trucks coming out. So we expect, looking at the adoption curve that has grown, just exploded in the last few years, we expect that to continue to grow even more, especially as governments are also, discussing restrictions on combustion vehicle sales in the 2030 to 2040 timeframe. So if we want to start, really phasing out traditional gasoline vehicles, we need to make sure that we have the infrastructure available to support widespread adoption of these plug-in electric vehicles. So why are we talking about MUDs, as well as this project also looks at some curbside residential options. Probably should have defined multi-unit dwelling, MUDs, you'll keep hearing that acronym, but is mostly referring to apartments and condos, but that can, MUD can refer to any type of housing where you've got more than one unit, from duplexes to high-rise towers to garden apartments. All those building types can fit into the MUD category. But the ability to charge at home is essential for EVs. About 90% of all kind of regular travel could be met by charging at home, and is the primary place that EV drivers charge. But a lot of Americans rent. And if you don't live in a single family home with your own garage that you own, getting charging can be difficult. So, the majority of Americans who are renting are not in single family homes. And even a high percentage of folks who own, there's, in big cities, a lot of condos. You look at a city like Santa Monica, California, more than 75% of residents live in multifamily, both rental and owned. And workplace charging has often been seen as a great alternative to those folks who don't have charging at home. And 43%, but 43% of folks who've bought EVs don't have access to workplace charging. And given the current environment, less people are driving into an office every day. And so workplace charging is great, but getting charging into people's houses where they are is one of the most important things for EV adoption. But when we look at what it actually takes to get charging into a multi-unit dwelling, it's a complicated picture. There's kind of the question of who owns. Is it a condo building? Is it a that's governed by an HOA? Is there a central property manager? Is it a small, mom and pop 6-8 unit building where you might have some direct interaction with the owner? When we look at the actual design and site layout, it's more complicated because people's parking isn't necessarily close to where their unit is, or necessarily close to where power is. It can be costly to install, much more costly than in a single family home. And the business models around cost recovery aren't fully proven yet. Cost recovery isn't necessarily the goal of every project, but it can be difficult just to make the numbers work for some projects. The energy and demand management side of things and the overall operating costs of charging are a consideration. Charging is normally much cheaper than filling your car with gas. But if you're triggering, high demand charges, depending on your utility, if it's pushing a facility into a higher tier of electricity rates, there can be challenges. And then access control. When you've got a lot of people living in a building, are you sharing the chargers? Are there certain people who have access to the chargers? Are they open to anyone? How do you control that access? Those are all questions that need to get asked. So how are we solving that in this VCI-MUD project? We're pleased to build a good group of partners and to get funding from the Department of Energy to pursue this project. So we started the project by engaging with stakeholders across the country to determine the barriers they experience with MUD charging. We recruited a great group of technology providers that have innovative technologies that can help to address some of these barriers. we're going to be compiling the project findings into an easy-to-use toolkit and disseminating the toolkit across national, regional, state, and local channels. And we're so happy to have a great crowd on the call as we start to disseminate some of this information. And we think through this process, we really are going to have an impact on the barriers for multi-unit charging. By collecting the data on existing charging, we can identify scenarios for these technologies to address the barriers. We can demonstrate these technologies that are going to reduce charging costs and make it easier to manage. And we're creating a toolkit that will help us to conduct outreach to MUD owners and residents to get charging. So when we talk about it being a nationwide scope, we are very proud of the team we've assembled and are happy to have so many great stakeholders participating on this project. There's 13 Clean Cities coalitions across the nation who are participating and will be helping to share the results of this project in their areas. But we're working with national labs, utilities, property owners, innovative technology providers and state and local governments to both get input and guidance on our project design, as well as to help kind of disseminate the findings of this project. And I know many of you are participating in the webinar today, so we're glad to have you on. So we wanted to go ahead and start talking about the preliminary data analysis that we've done. And before that, we're going to talk about the barriers, but we're curious what kind of barriers that you see in MUD charging. Which barrier are you most concerned about? So you can go ahead and click the poll box that should pop up at your window. There's management and HOA approvals that can be a barrier. The installation costs are a barrier. Operating costs can be a barrier, parking limitations, and electrical limitations as well. This is just to select one question. We know all these can be barriers, but we'd love to know for today's call, which one of these barriers do you think is the biggest or are you most concerned about when talking about charging for multi-unit dwellings? So we'll give you a second to answer that before displaying results. As a reminder, if you've got questions throughout the webinar, you can type them into the Q&A box. If there's some basic clarifying questions, we might try to answer them during section breaks. And otherwise, we're going to have lots of time at the end for Q&A as well. So looking at the poll results, it looks like installation costs was a clear winner. If you can call that a winner, it's a clear barrier, just the cost of installation and who pays for it. But electrical limitations and the management and HOA approvals are also big barriers, and operating costs and parking limitations, can be figured out, although all those things take time and money and approvals to do. So those can also be barriers. So going ahead, wanted to talk about the baseline data collection we did. So to start this project, we collected the largest data set on EV charging sessions that has ever been assembled, as far as we know. And then we cleaned and analyzed this data to help inform baseline conditions for innovation. So we collected over 500,000 EV charge sessions, data on those sessions. But then we did a lot of cleaning to try to get to what is actually located at an MUD or directly serving an MUD, and was there complete enough data on these sessions to really show a real charge, or were there data artifacts or other programs. So that came down to about 24,000 charging sessions that were directly on charging at MUDs, and another few thousand sessions that were at level 2 or DC fast chargers that seem to serve an MUD audience. We did get, this is not just a California project or a New York project. We did get data from almost a dozen states, from multiple networks and over multiple years. We did see over the years, a lot more data in 2019 than in all the other years combined. And this data collection happened in early 2020, so we didn't have full calendar year 2020 data. And this data, confirmed some things we expected to see, but a lot of this was, we hadn't ever seen this graph before. So we were excited to see, that increasing annual usage that I mentioned. We also saw, what we expected, which was over a 12-hour average session. That's, each vehicle spends more than 12 hours plugged in when they're at a apartment or a condo, but the vehicles are only actively charging for about a quarter of that, or 3.6 hours. And the energy profiles were similar for both longer and shorter sessions, in that, most of the cars, get fully charged within the first couple hours and then trail off. And this really highlights the opportunity to increase utilization. If you can, get more vehicles charging or have that power shared across more vehicles, and you can use that whole 12 hours to charge the vehicles instead of having them fully charged in a short time and then just sitting there plugged in. So we did look for level 2 charging that was supporting multi-unit dwellings. That included curbside locations that were in residential neighborhoods. And again, we saw that increasing annual usage year over year. There, the average session length was under 3 hours, and most of that session was spent actively charging. For those MUD supporting, those were mostly had a fee associated with them, so folks are incentivized to move after their session. And if your car is out in public, you have an incentive to move it as well. But again, the energy profiles were similar for shorter and longer sessions, and there is an opportunity to increase utilization of those MUD supporting stations. So in summary, we definitely saw that there was a charging station kind of capacity utilization gap, if you can call that, that the vehicles were occupying a plug for 12 hours, but only needed the power for a portion of that. We did see that the off-site charging, both for DC and level 2, could be a good option when charging on-site was not available, but we didn't have enough data to make a strong consensus on how best that those stations could serve. And locating this data was a lot harder than we expected. We had some data partners as we went into the project and looked for more properties that were willing to share their data, and talked to all the utilities, and lots of them knew there were some buildings that had charging, but it wasn't separately metered. They're non-network stations, and we weren't able to get some of that data. So what we did have was very valuable. It also, the data we have shows a portion of a vehicle's charging behavior, but we don't know how many of those charge sessions or charge sessions that were represented by drivers, were those drivers also charging at work or in the public, or on different networks. So we don't have a complete charging picture from this EVSE, but I think we have a really good picture of what charging looks like at a multi-unit dwelling that didn't really exist before this project. So in addition to this quantitative data, the qualitative data and the barriers work we did was really important. So we interviewed almost 100 different stakeholders, and to get information on their attitudes towards charging, and what barriers they saw. And we tried to divide these up into some different categories. but when we looked at how do you segregate these barriers, we really saw a big divide between apartment buildings and condominium buildings. And from an installation process standpoint, the apartment building can be a little simpler once the apartment owner or manager is ready to put in charging, because they're generally the decision maker. They can make the ruling and make it happen. But condominiums can be a complicated and political, for lack of a better term, process of working with the HOA, as well as other kind of complexities with the ownership structure, things like permitting. But we, through all these interviews, we identified some key barriers, which includes education and awareness. For both property types, the folks making the decisions need to understand, what technologies are available, what the process is, are they aware that there is a demand for charging on their property? But those financial barriers are definitely large. The kind of electrical capacity and preparedness is a big one, and just the physical design of buildings and parking layout is also a big barrier. So we did a kind of in-person one-on-one interviews. We actually also had a survey that went out to a number of stakeholders, and these were kind of the top barriers that came through: information and education. It's hard for folks to make a decision on charging if they don't know if there's vehicle or drivers at their building or people who will buy an EV. But these residents won't consider buying an EV if they don't know that they can get charging in their building. Certainly all the HOA management issues, limitations on parking, whether that's deeded parking or, there's nowhere you can flexibly have some charging that is shared by multiple people, or just the parking is far away from the electrical panel. It's very difficult to get power out to your parking area. Issues with how you operate your parking, and just the capital constraints is a big one. Grants and incentives are needed to make this happen for some folks, and even with grants and incentives, it can be unaffordable for many installations. Electrical related cost of installation goes right in with that capital constraint. And the ongoing operation costs, and network signals actually a big issue. I didn't get as many responses, but as we've talked to stakeholders, for larger buildings with underground parking, for any of the network station options, that normally would work with a cell connection, don't work underground, and you have to install Wi-Fi routers or cellular repeaters or more communications wiring in addition to the power wiring, and that can become a barrier as well. The good news is that we've got some technology providers in the program that are demonstrating technologies that can help overcome some of these barriers. I do see we've got some Q&A. We'll see if there's any quick clarifying questions. And the one I see is on the session data. So it was correct that we collected about 500,000 sessions, but only those charts I showed only included data from a small portion of those. And the reason was some of those were public charging that we couldn't see regular usage from people. So one of the things for MUD supporting was seeing that there were some regular users who were using those stations on a weekly or multiple times a week, and other data was just not in a format that we could actually see kind of power flows or hours. They might have just been a log in, log out, and some of them were not successful charges at all. You could see a session initialized, but never any power flowing. So there's various data cleaning there. We will, as we get into the innovative charging technologies, have more analysis of these technologies and how they're actually working in real world. That's going to further our knowledge on EV charging. One other question I did see is, will these slides be available as PDFs so we can study the data more carefully? Yes, both a recording of this webinar and slides are going to be available. And with that, I'm going to jump into talking about the innovative technologies. Again, we will have lots of time at the end for more Q&A. So what are these innovative technologies we're looking at? We're looking at access control, billing, and or data collection for non-network stations. We found that a lot of buildings had put in some non-network stations kind of as their pilot, but without data from those, without the ability to bill, you can't really understand how those are being used or manage those smartly in the future. So we have some technologies that can work as a retrofit to non-network stations that can then offer those management capabilities. We've got technologies that manage electrical energy through various kind of software and hardware controls. This can minimize demand charges to reduce operating costs and utilize time of use tariffs and incentives for off-peak charging. Those technologies also overlap with the technologies that maximize existing electrical infrastructure to minimize or delay upgrades. So, most older buildings may have capacity for a few stations, but definitely don't have capacity for a large proportion of stations. But if you can share that power across multiple vehicles, multiple ports, without having to pay for those expensive upgrades, you can get the most out of your existing infrastructure. And one thing that drivers need is kind of reliability to know they can get a charge. And so some of these technologies allow easy reserving of stations or scheduling charging sessions so that a station will be available when you need it. We are also continuing to analyze DC fast charging that's nearby MUDs and to see if there are area residents that can use those as their everyday fueling station. And that does avoid the charges, all the challenges associated with installing and managing EVSE kind of on a parking location. It looks a little bit more like a gas station model, but we think that can be an alternative when, for whatever reason, it's just not feasible to get charging at a building. So we talked with a lot of technology providers and provided an opportunity for many to get in the project, but we ended up with these 7 technology providers listed, with some with multiple demos. So Liberty plugins and their Hydra systems allows a single power input to control multiple EVSE. And they can use non-network stations with kind of the network and access control done externally, which can be more cost effective than individual networked units. PowerFlex offers a highly scalable adaptive power management system that works great with large number of stations. We're looking at buildings that are installing 50 or 100 stations now, and PowerFlex can make the most of limited electrical capacity. OpConnect offers a smart charging network service and equipment that's also flexible to meet property owners' needs. FreeWire offers Mobi, which is a dual port EVSE that's kind of a rolling battery on wheels, so it can charge in one location and then move through the parking lot to charge multiple vehicles. The Electric Vehicle Institute offers kind of the off-site charging with membership options that allow regular use by MUD residents for both DC and level 2. Cyber switching offers a dedicated circuit that you can rotate a single dedicated circuit between 4 more plugs. And EV Match offers a flexible networking options that allow scheduling and reservations, notifications, billing, data collection, analytics to really help property managers better manage their charging. So we've got all these technology providers participating in the program, and these technologies are being demonstrated at various real world locations right now. Because of COVID impacts, we had some delays at getting some of these, but we should have some preliminary findings on these technologies available later in June. And but we're going to continue to collect data. Hopefully, as life returns to normal later this year, we might see a change in charging patterns, as well as just a greater amount of data available that we can analyze to really see the impact of these charging. So we'll be collecting utilization data from all these stations, from these different technologies, and we'll be summarizing the findings in case studies of these technologies. And we'll be looking not just at pure utilization and throughput, but we're really hoping to show the business case for these, looking at what were the electrical service costs, what were the capital costs of installation, how does that compare to the service fees and the revenue available from these stations, and again have kind of case study outputs that demonstrate the business case. We're also getting feedback from the multi-unit dwelling property owners and operators, as well as the residents, including some non-EV charging residents, asking what their reactions to having this infrastructure available to them is. And all those findings and case studies are going to get put in kind of a toolkit, which we'll talk about now. As a reminder, if you've got questions, there's a Q&A box that lets we can see your questions, and we'll have time at the end to answer those. I see there's also some stuff in the chat box. We're not going to answer them directly if it's in the chat box, but we'll you can take a look, and there's certainly lots of expertise on this call as you have some chat in the background as well. So the toolkit is going to be a compilation of tools and resources that help address deployment barriers. And some of the components of this toolkit include a multi-unit dwelling EVSE journey roadmap guide. So that's something that really walks people through the steps of getting charging. And there's an empowerment toolkit that's really aimed more at the residents to, how do you advocate for getting charging in your building? And there's a building self-evaluation survey that helps buildings think through kind of what is the scope of getting charging for their buildings, a technology selection and recommendation tool, and then an outreach presentation tools that are going to help stakeholders, including the Clean Cities coalitions, engage in their areas around getting charging for multi-unit dwellings. So this toolkit is in draft right now, but we wanted to just highlight some of these components. So the MUD Journey Roadmap Guide is focused around this graphic that really clearly shows all the steps to charging, and then there'll be information resources behind each stage, and it can kind of be your top dashboard for easy navigation, so you can think through what steps you are on for your EV project. The next item in the toolkit is the Resident and Building Guide, what we call the Empowerment Toolkit. So it provides great education information to educate the major stakeholders, especially residents, to advocate for EV charging in their building, as well as helping building owners start to understand the business case for EV charging. We're working with project partner Qmerit, who is a major provider of referrals for installation services, connecting kind of interested users to installation services. But they've helped us identify, what are the questions that building managers and owners need to know about their buildings, and what are the barriers that they can identify to get charging. And going through this survey will help properties, understand what the barriers are and guide them through, what's the scope of the project that would make sense for their building, and have that in hand when they're ready to go talk to contractors or vendors on what kind of project they should pursue. And that tool also ties into our technology selection or recommendation tool. So, folks can start with the toolkit to get some information generally about charging, thinking about what they need. They can go through that kind of building readiness siting survey to think about their physical site situations, what's their electrical situations, what kind of vision do they have or preferences for an EV charging program. And then they can take that output and go to this technology tool and say, okay, what technologies, given my constraints, given what I'm looking for in charging, what technologies would work for me. And so that tool will help, recommend some technologies and point folks to those case studies that show how these different technologies can work for MUD charging. And finally, we'll have kind of slide deck and slide deck templates that our Clean Cities coordinators and other stakeholders who are trying to promote EV charging in multi-unit dwellings can use. So it will contain some of these project learnings, information on the barriers, information on the technology demonstrations, like we just talked about, and all these other toolkit resources that are available or will be available to walk folks through the MUD EV charging installation process. So I believe we had one more poll question. We'd love to know, which of those resources sounds interesting or useful to you. You can select one, or you can select multiple on this one. All these tools, are in development, but we'd be interested to know which ones of these you're most excited about or think might be most relevant to your own work. So you can click a few boxes and we'll display results in a second. So it looks like there's some interest in all the tools, but the technology selection recommendation tool is coming out on top here. But looks like all of you saw some interest and value in these tools, and hopefully as we further develop these, they will prove very valuable in the marketplace. So how do you get involved in this project? So for many of you, this might be the first time you're hearing about it, but we're glad you're here. And for those of you who've been involved, you might have heard our spiel before. But currently, we got a domain name, VCI-MUD.org. Right now, it just goes to a landing page on For's website with some initial information on this project. It's currently only a landing page, but it's being developed as a project website that's going to host all the toolkit content. And right now we are working on refining all the toolkit content. So we will have some testing going on in the next few months. If you're interested in participating as an early access tester of the toolkit content, please respond to the project staff emails on here, and we can set you up to be an early access tester. But the goal is to have both the first complete draft of the toolkit content as well as this website up by late summer of this year. And then we'll be doing a lot more events to promote and drive traffic to the Toolkit website, and hopefully drive use of all these materials that we're doing. So some upcoming events. This is the first in a series of webinars. So if you're interested in learning more about those technology providers and seeing kind of a live demonstration of their innovations, we will be doing webinars with the technology providers in April and May. So if you're registered for this, you'll receive information on those webinars when they're scheduled. There is the Roadmap Conference in June. We'll be sharing information. The Green Transportation Summit and Expo, GTSE, who's our partner on this webinar series. We also hope to have a session at their conference in August. And we're working with partners for more engagement throughout the latter half of 2021 and into 2022. The goal of this project was not just to do some demonstrations, but to get this information out there widely. So, any opportunities you have, if you work for local government or a utility and you want to get more information on EV charging into your jurisdictions, please let us know. Reach out to the project team, and we can work with you to try to get something scheduled. And with that, we're going to transition into the Q&A. My colleague Rick Tebay may help read off and answer some of the questions as well. And we look forward to some good discussion. So as a reminder, if you can type your questions into the question and answer box, we'll be able to answer them there. And that's my email address, as well as Rick's email address. And we're happy after the webinar as well to answer more questions or let us know if you want to get involved in the project in any way.
Kevin, the first question is from California, and it applies to other states as well. Is there any way to require complex owners to make EV charging available to you? And who pays for what?
Thank you. That's a great question. So California does have a right to charge law, and we're aware of some other states have passed those too. I believe in the Pacific Northwest and Virginia. Well, I don't want to name other names, but that will be a component in the toolkit. We'll have information on which states we're aware of with right to charge laws. The big catch on California's right to charge laws is they do have laws that apply to both apartments and condos. But in both cases, it doesn't force a building owner or manager to install charging for you. It just says that they can't prevent you from installing charging at your own cost. And so, if you're in a condo building and you own a unit and you plan on staying there for a long time, maybe you're willing to make the investment for yourself over the long term. But for a short-term renter, you may not want to make that investment. And additionally, the California law, says that an HOA can't put unreasonable restrictions on you. But for an HOA that doesn't have the electrical capacity to install multiple stations, they might not want to approve someone just installing, the first person who raises their hand gets to install their own station, and then everyone else is out of luck. So those laws are helpful, but we think some of the technologies and other management decisions, still need some thought behind them to be able to get EV charging.
So another question regarding that is, my HOA offers charging stations, but they are connected to a commercial account, the HOAs, and the rates are high, and overnight lower charging rates are not available, which makes charging uneconomical. And is there an answer for this?
Yeah, that's another great question, and that's definitely a barrier. Utility rates are, obviously individual to each utility, but what you describe is a common problem is when you install EV charging on a what we call a house meter, the meter that's shared with other common area loads. It's often on a commercial rate that doesn't offer lower rates. There are often opportunities to change rates, and if you have the amount of EV charging that can be done overnight, it can become economical if your utility offers a lower overnight rate to switch rates on that meter. But your other options are either to install additional utility meters, which can get costly, or to participate in some sub-metering programs. Not all utilities offer them. In fact, most don't. But as these EV charging units themselves are networked and have metering capabilities in them, some utilities are allowing their use as a sub-meter, so that those units can be billed separately from the rest of the electrical usage.
One other thing I'd mention is that some of the early installations have contracts, and the contracts require that they either they have a certain life, and so the building is committed to that particular provider. So if they are going to add additional units, they have to be from that provider and have to be part of that network. And the contract either has to lapse and expire before you can enter into a new agreement. So it can be really complicated for some of the older installations. Another question is, will this document examine different business models and how to create value for property owners and savings for the tenants and drivers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the business models we are looking at are either for both HOAs and apartments are, is there a chance at cost recovery, both for operating costs as well as capital costs? But some of the providers do offer a kind of a turnkey third party, where the vendor, EV charging station vendor, is actually owning the unit and billing out the unit, and hoping to have with no cost or limited cost to the property owner, versus in other cases the property owners are owning and operating themselves. So we will look at both of those models. In terms of how value is created, that's an interesting question, and there's some amenities like washer dryer in unit that residents demand, versus having a common laundry room, where you can see different methods of value creation for a property owner. But there's other things property owners do, such as landscaping, that might not have a direct return on investment for improving your landscaping, But there's a value to having a attractive building in terms of tenant retention, ability to maintain rent levels and things like that. So we will be talking to property owners about what their attitudes are towards providing charging, and what benefits they see for doing charging.
Another question is, with the push to electrify all vehicle types, is it too soon to consider larger vocational vehicles with potentially different charging needs? These are often personal vehicles, or at least return to home with the owner.
Yeah, that's a great question. And at the beginning we mentioned pickup trucks, but work vans as well. And if we're really going to ban internal combustion vehicles sometime in the next 10 or 20 years, we absolutely need to consider all vehicle types. So some of those vans or trucks might have slightly higher charging rates and just energy demand in general. So charging at 11 kilowatts instead of 6 or 7 kilowatts, and they might still have the average usage of only 3 or 4 hours if the average plumber or contractor doesn't drive that much more. But we certainly need to be planning for the future and these future vehicles for installations today, because by the time you get something installed, it might already be obsolete if you were installing for the vehicles that were available in 2016, for example. But generally we think that the technologies with kind of smart management and load management can make the most. And if you've got some vehicles that need more power and some vehicles that need less power, hopefully those technologies can help get more power to the vehicles that need more power. But the power needs to be there in the first place at the buildings to be able to get it out to those different vehicles.
Kevin, another question is, it takes 18 to 24 months for a tenant to make a purchase decision after the EVSE is installed and available. What strategies are you looking to cover that, closing that timing gap? Or is that even being addressed?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So some of it is education and outreach at the beginning, so that if we encourage building owners to do a survey of who's interested or who says they would be interested in getting a vehicle if charging was available. But you're absolutely right that there's a delay even when people won't buy the car just because they think there's going to be charging. They need to see it kind of at the building and operating often before they make that choice. So beyond education and encouraging communication between property owners or managers and residents, I'm not sure that we directly address that, but it's definitely something that again, incentives can help. If that incentives can help offset some of the capital costs, because you won't see a good usage or a return on your investment for some months. So it is a financial consideration. But I think again, looking at where the market is going, hopefully property owners can see it as a longer term investment that's going to be needed in the future. The other bit is on building codes. In California, there's been EV readiness requirements in new construction since 2013, and they've been increasing in every triennial code cycle. And other cities like Seattle and Chicago are adopting fairly aggressive EV readiness ordinances, which don't say you have to have the charging installed today, but you have to be building your buildings with the capacity and the flexibility to add charging in the future. So hopefully, new construction is ready, and when residents are ready to get charging, it can be a pretty quick process to get charging available in those buildings.
Kevin, we have a couple of questions that are around the same area. And the question is that the firm has a technology that they would really like to see included in the guidebook. And the question is this still open, or is it too late to be included?
Yeah, so as we're the website and the toolkit are under development. In terms of our core technology providers and kind of the demonstration, those are fairly set at this point. But the goal with the website is to be, include as many existing resources as available, which can potentially include listing of, additional vendors, additional technologies, et cetera. Just won't have as much case study behind it. But definitely, if you're a technology provider and you've got information, please reach out and share that.
Another comment is concerning level 1. The presentation seems to be biased towards level 2. And is there any reason that level 1 data was not captured and discussed? Level 1 can be a much more effective, cost-effective solution for MUD owners and a more convenient, better experience for EV driving tenants.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are in discussing with some stakeholders and some areas that are doing level 1 demonstrations on their own. We definitely don't have anything against level 1 charging, and definitely agree it can be cost effective, especially in a retrofit environment where you can kind of take advantage of some existing power capacity or even existing circuits. When we started this project, there weren't really any level 1 projects that we could find that had data that was already available. Most of the level 1 we were aware of was just kind of wall outlets that people were plugging into, and so there just wasn't that much data available. We do know now that there's some ongoing studies, and including the San Francisco Bay Area with Peninsula Clean Energy and East Bay Clean Energy CCAs, and so we'll have information from those studies linked to in the toolkit, and definitely would encourage buildings that can make level 1 charging happen cost effectively and quickly, go for level 1. It does, back to the question about, what about the, future guy with a plumbing van that needs, 50 kilowatt hours a day. Level 1 might not meet his needs, but certainly level 1 for the, average commuter who's driving, 20, 30 miles max, level 1 can be a cost-effective solution. And we definitely in this project don't want to exclude any good solutions, but we want to just make sure that the information is out there.
And along those same lines, I think there are 2 different considerations. One is if you're doing a small battery hybrid where there's limited use on a daily basis. I saw something here that said 30 miles a day. Level 1 might be more than adequate for that. But if you're talking about a shift where now you're suburban and people are have longer commutes, or maybe they use a car for business during the day, and they've got a larger car, they've got an SUV or a coming pickup truck, level 1 will be woefully inadequate for that. Final thought on level 1 is that a lot of us see the level 1s in the garage and we'd say, why can't we plug into those? And those are all daisy chained. And so you've got multiple level 1s on a single circuit. And if you were plugging a microwave into each one of those, it wouldn't take you too far down the wall to simply blow the circuit, because the demand exceeded the design of that circuit. So you almost have to put in new circuitry to really do justice to level 1 if you're going to do any at scale level 1 charging.
Yeah, those are all good points, Rick. And when it comes to installing a 20 amp, a dedicated 20 amp 120 volt circuit for the same cost, almost, you can install a dedicated 20 amp or 30 amp 240 volt circuit. So it's not necessarily a big cost savings, but it can be in certain situations. So we, again, definitely don't want to exclude level 1 at all.
Kevin, have any of the sites been able to take advantage of the PACE program? And specifically, if the EVSE is solar or wind tied, or connected to energy from solar or wind?
None. So we definitely looked at kind of options, both financing options as well as options for kind of integration of renewables is a consideration. I'm not sure if any of these projects that we're featuring actually used PACE, but I know at least in California that EV charging is an eligible technology for PACE programs. There's also in California an additional program called CalCap, which is the California Capital Access Program that offers kind of low interest loans for EV charging. The challenge is, does the cash flow from charging is that enough to offset kind of the loan payments or the financing payments? And it's it's not always the case that you can get the cash flow to make fully cover the cost of those loan payments. But the other bit on energy efficiency projects, if you've got a program, if you've got a lender, if you've got electricians, in your building doing LED lighting upgrades, perhaps you are freeing up some electrical capacity that can be kind of allocated to EV charging. But it's, it definitely can be cheaper to get the charging installed, if you've already got contractors on site running wires or doing other upgrades, and if you can combine the project into a financial package, that could potentially be pretty helpful.
I'm gonna go ahead and send you a softball. For MUDs that have street parking only, has there been any exploration of teaming up with local community to provide charging to nearby tenants? And I'm going to add, is that going to be included in the guide?
Yeah. So one of the technology providers does offer kind of charging that's off-site, but is designed to serve residents nearby. And we've also been in touch with places that are doing curbside charging, that is kind of street parking for people who don't have charging at home, can use those stations. There are some kind of management concerns with that, but we'll include information and resources that have information on the permitting and code requirements in various cities that are doing curbside. And one of the vendors participating in the project, EV Match, besides offering kind of control software for charging on units, also has an EV sharing and opportunity. So, people who have, charging in their driveway that they're willing to let other folks use. There's through the EV Match app, as well as through some other apps, there's opportunities to share. If for example, I want to offer charging to folks who live down the street from me, but don't have who live in an apartment or a duplex that doesn't have parking.
And there is a question about which tech provider does the off-street charging. And I don't know if you want to answer that online or offline.
So EV Institute, who's based in the Maryland, DC area, is a turnkey provider that has that we're working with, that can provide kind of the offsite charging, but certainly there's a whole growing universe of EV charging vendors that do commercial, public, and workplace charging as well.
Okay. If an individual's meter in a condo is a sub-meter of the building's master meter, is the individual charged at a commercial or residential rate?
So if you can hook up the EV charging to your individual meter, then the billing should be the same as your individual meter if you're on an applicable residential rate. But if the the charging is coming directly off of the main meter, it might be on kind of whatever main meter commercial rate. So the answer is it's complicated, but thinking about how you meter is going to make is an important question. We also know that tariffs are changing. California is moving even on the single family home residential towards mandatory time of use rates that put the cost of energy different at different times. Certainly with the news out of Texas recently, there's going to be a lot more interest in what variable rates look like, and how we can make sure that people have access to low rates for overnight charging, but also if there are higher rates during periods of high demand, how do we give people the tools to control their usage during that time so that the charging can happen at the lowest cost possible.
Kevin, once the guide is finalized, will it be possible for other clean city coalitions to adapt pieces of the residential toolkit and localize it for their regions?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can definitely work with individual coalitions if they want some editable files. The toolkit, kind of the presentation slide deck, is going to be designed to be fully editable depending on your audience. And if you want to give a 10-minute presentation or a 30-minute presentation, we can have slides through there. There might be some issues with kind of permissions and certain things you can't just copy and paste. But we definitely want these materials to be used and potentially to be adapted, because we know that that every region is different, especially on that utility subject that we were just talking about. If an individual utility wants to include something with information on their rates or programs available in their state, I saw someone said that Oregon definitely has a right to charge law that's modeled on California. So we definitely want to encourage folks to use these materials widely and well, because we want to get to the zero emissions future, but we know there's a lot of help and a lot of work that will have to be done to make that happen.
Kevin, will a guide include recommendations as to how to get better utilization, greater capacity utilization? And they're referencing slide 12, where the vehicle was plugged in 12 hours, but only charged for about 3.
Yeah, so that yeah, there'll be both general information as well as when we look at the case studies of the technologies. Hopefully, we'll see be able to see how some of those technologies can smartly share the power. In a workplace situation, often through pricing mechanisms, by charging people more money when their vehicle is plugged in but not charging, you can encourage folks to go out and use that. But it's definitely not fair or ideal to do that in a residential situation. So that, I actually had this happen at a hotel I stayed at once, where after it started charging me a bunch of money after my car was done charging, but I arrived at the hotel at 11 p.m., plugged my car in and went straight to sleep, and didn't notice that it texted me at 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. that it was time to move my car. So those types of price mechanisms don't work. So having kind of the hardware or software controls that move that power to another plug when the first car is done with it can make sense. The other thing I think we're seeing with longer range vehicles is you don't need to plug in every day. You could plug in every day and only need to charge for an hour. But if you've got a 200-mile vehicle, you drive 30 miles a day, maybe you only need to plug in every third or fourth day. So instead of plugging in every day for 3 hours, you could plug in, not plug in for 3 days, but get a reservation in the system that guarantees that charging spot to you. So on the third day, you can let your car charge for a full 8 or 10 hours. So reservations can be very helpful in terms of giving people the confidence that the charging is going to be available when they really need it.
Okay, final question. Have you been able to come up with a dollar cost per foot average or a range for a power run from the source to the charging station?
So we don't have that data yet, specifically for any of the technologies, but there has been a lot of focus on EV charging costs. There's a Department of Energy report from 2015 that we've often used as a baseline, and it shows installation costs can be $200 a unit or $20,000 per unit, and it does have some good descriptions on what are some of the costs per foot for surface mounted conduit versus ground mounted conduit. But we are looking surface mounted versus underground conduit. We do have some more data coming in from California incentive projects on what actual installation costs are. That's being documented, and to the extent possible, we're getting data from our providers here. But yeah, getting the power from the panel to the charging station is often the most difficult, and can be more expensive than the unit. And in the future, you can change out a dumb unit for a smart unit and utilize the same power. And we've actually already seen that happen in California at least 3 times. And I know Rick, you were involved in some of this, where we put in stations for the original EV1s in the 90s.
Yep.
Around 2010, you replace those with kind of modern J1770
Networked. Yep.
Some of them were non-networked, and then you've gone back and replaced them with networked or with smart power sharing. So
the big thing is getting the power there in the first place. And the other piece I would say is it really depends on, as you say, it's the length of the run. So the greater the distance, the bigger the cable. The other thing is, are you running it on a surface mount along a wall or a ceiling, or are you trenching? And then there's a difference between trenching and underground, and going just boring underground. So there are a lot of different ways there are, and sadly there aren't. I don't know of any really solid numbers for cost per foot.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean the actual equipment cost, or not equipment, but materials cost of a foot of conduit and a foot of 6-gauge cable are somewhat knowable. I just saw someone in the chat that said $500 to $1,000 per 10-foot for conduit in Chicago installations. That range sounds within the what I've heard from other regions, factor in the cost of the contractor, and there's a cost just to have the electrician out to your site, and then each additional 10 feet might be a little less, but yeah, there's always the base cost to get someone out there. But hopefully the more that we can build flexible systems that are scalable, we can start to drive down the costs, because there's great energy savings potential for EVs, but if you only have access to expensive public charging stations, or the vehicle cost is coming down, so it's conventional to an ICE, but you have to spend a lot of money on the installation. There's obviously challenges, but hopefully with the materials we're developing and the partners we have on this project, we're really going to help address those barriers and drive some change in this important market. Yeah, hopefully that answered most of the questions we had today. We definitely appreciate all your time and attention listening in, and we look forward to hearing more from folks. And again, these slides and a recording will be made available to the folks registered today, as well as with links and information about how you can get more involved. So thank you again, everyone, for attending, and happy charging out there.